The media attention was overwhelming. I really didn't have time to react or to reflect on what was going on. It was just go, go, go. After that, I had a lot of people, particularly within the party, say, I can't believe you did that. Can't believe you spoke out about the party. And I'm like, what do you mean? They asked me questions and I, answered them with my truth. I didn't even realize how frowned upon that would have been, because other people in my situation would have just stayed quiet, not commented, and then just go away quietly.
We're extremely excited and grateful to have Tu Lee. Tu is a community worker, advocate and organiser, currently working in the community legal sector assisting victim survivors of domestic and family violence and coordinating capacity building and community legal education programs. Tu also previously served as the General Secretary of the Vietnamese Community in New South Wales. She also co-founded Y-Collab, a youth advocacy organisation providing opportunities for young people in southwest Sydney to create a positive social impact in their local communities through grassroots youth-led initiatives. Through her work, Tu is committed to fighting for greater diversity and justice in Australian society and more recently in politics. Most recently, she was also featured as one of the 21 most inspirational women of 2021 for Vogue Australia. Tu, welcome to the Level Asian podcast.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
So I want to kick this off because we were just having a chat here about Sefton, which is that Tu went to high school with both Davey and I. Mm-hmm. And it's not bragging rights because we say that we know Tu, but I think it's more importantly just to give everyone some context. And I think my first thoughts, when we sort of originally were getting you on the show was, I remember you posted when you were going to run for Labor, and I remember how much of a response you got. Because I think for me was really, up until that point, I didn't really know anyone who was in politics. It was the first time I was like, I know someone who I knew fairly well. We had a lot of exchanges in high school. And I was like, wow. Okay, wow, there's someone actually going to politics, Asian descent. But secondly, it sort of didn't actually surprise me a whole lot either. Because in high school, you were definitely very involved.
You were the white swan of September.
You were definitely very involved with a lot of that stuff. And so, I think it was a bit of an oxymoron where I was surprised, but not surprised that it was coming from you as well. Can you share with us just a little bit about when you first put up that post, what sort of reaction you had when that sort of came out?
Well, first of all, thank you. That's a really nice thing to say. And the white swan too. Well, when I had first... you mean when I first had announced that I was going to run? Yeah, I think it was... just surprised. A lot of people were surprised because you don't really see young people of colour running in federal politics. They might try to get involved in local politics, potentially state, but federal politics, when you look at the makeup of the parliament, it's a very homogenous group. It's mainly middle-aged white men with very similar life experiences, a particular elitist political class, if you like. So I think it was quite surprising for a lot of people. I think it wasn't necessarily surprising for me, but to be fair, I would not have done that, and I don't think I would have had the opportunity to even put my hand up if it wasn't for the outgoing member and his support and sponsorship to push me into that. Because I think before that, I just thought there's no way. You don't see people like me in those spaces, and I just didn't think it was something that was attainable. And so I think when I had thrown my hat in the ring, it had taken people by surprise, and they were really excited that we're going to have essentially, someone like us actually represent us in Parliament, and that was a really exciting and new thing to see.
Yeah, because that's how I felt. I was like, one of us, and I think we were talking about Phil Liao's podcast, and he talks about the whole when he achieved the Commonwealth Games thing, it was one of us as us Asians, right? Mm-hmm. So I definitely felt that when the news broke out as well, and I was super excited, and obviously wanted to see that all go. And I think we don't really need to necessarily cover what happened because that's just been covered ad nauseum as well. Mm-hmm. I sort of want to wind it back, and obviously it's definitely for the audience to understand all the way back to your parents actually coming to Australia. We like to sort of start right at the beginning. So can you tell us a little bit the circumstances of your parents coming to Australia and what that was like?
I think my story is very similar to any second generation kid whose parents had come from Vietnam. So after the Vietnam War, my parents fled. My dad actually left first after the war, and he took the journey by boat. So he's a boat person, Vietnamese boat person, came to Australia, and then he sponsored my mum and my sisters over. So they were quite young when he had left. And so I think my second sister was just born and he left. And he just, made the decision, there's no way that I put my family through that journey going on boat, not sure whether or not you survive or not. And then when he made it to Australia, it actually took them 7 years to reunite. So he was very adamant to come here and to re-educate himself. So a lot of the qualifications, and they still don't for a lot of people in different countries, in various countries, they don't recognise the qualification here. So if you've been a doctor for 30 years in your home country, you come here and you can't practice. You'd have to re-qualify. So my dad did that, but of course at first he had to learn English because he didn't know a word of English. So he did that for 7 years, learned English, went to university, and then sponsored my mum and sisters over. So then they had spent 7 years of their life without my dad around, and then I was born. So I was born soon after that when my mum and dad were reunited here.
Wow, and that was in Adelaide?
Yeah, so my dad actually told me this story. He said that when the immigration officer asked him, why do you want to come to Australia? What do you want to do? Besides, fleeing persecution and a communist regime, he said, I want to study. And so they're like, okay, well, you go to Adelaide. So that's what he told me. And so he moved to Adelaide and did all that. And so I was born in Adelaide, but my family moved to Sydney when I was about 2 or 3 years old. So I grew up all my life in southwest Sydney and don't remember much about Adelaide at all.
So your dad studied what?
So he did computer engineering or computer science. Yeah.
Nice. So was he kind of like intellectual when he was, teaching you, or when you were growing up?
Well, I think like a lot of Asian families, education was really important. So there was definitely strong encouragement for me to do well at school and focus on school. And I think for a lot of families and a lot of migrant families, we see education as really the ticket. To success, to a better life, especially when your parents didn't necessarily have that opportunity or had come here. Like the sacrifice that he made was that, for a lot of other families who all migrated at once or fled Vietnam and came as refugees, they had to start working right away because they had their family there that they had to support, whereas my dad was on his own and he was then able to focus on his education. But then that took sacrificing 7 years without your family there. I think education is just the key, right? And so there was always a push to do well. I think I had that ingrained in me, so I didn't mind it, and I saw that I understood the value of education. But yeah, I'm sure all Asian kids would have been forced to or encouraged very strongly to focus on their studies.
In terms of communication at home, I'm really curious to know, did you speak English at home or did you grow up speaking different languages?
So my parents were really intent on ensuring that we maintained our mother tongue. So I was actually forced, and I would say forced, to go to Vietnamese school every Saturday. I know a lot of my friends hated it. Actually, everyone hated it, right? Because you go to school 5 days a week, and then on Saturday you got to spend a couple of hours in the classroom again, whereas you could have been playing sports or going to birthday parties. So it was a bit of a chore. And I know a lot of my friends are like, nah, I hate it. And then the parents give up. My parents never did. So they really pushed me through it. I actually did Vietnamese continuous for my HSC.
Wow.
Yeah, it actually didn't count in the end because I did extra units and it was my lowest mark. So I didn't count. But looking back, I am super grateful that, learning the language and more than just conversationally, like learning it academically, has just really helped me in my life. And we always talk about how powerful languages and learning languages is. But for some reason, a lot of people don't like learning their own mother tongue. And I think that has a lot to do with the environment you grow in, where you feel almost ashamed to talk or to speak your own language. And whilst you may do that at home because, it's imposed on you and you have your grandparents that you need to communicate with, I think it's a real shame that kids didn't feel proud to be able to speak their mother tongue. And I think that's changing. I have friends my age now who really regret not learning learning it, and then now are going to look for Vietnamese tutors to teach them Vietnamese and learn it as an adult.
That's so weird because like I feel like that's like a common theme with a lot of our guests where they literally get sent to like a language school on a Saturday. Like we actually spoke to Erin Chu just before this podcast, and she Malaysian Chinese literally was the same thing Saturday. She was like she said she would have people ask her what she was doing on the Saturday, and she said she'd go to tuition, not language school. That's how much shame there was. So it's just weird. I don't think I have never did it, but like my parents definitely enforced learning like Mandarin, for example, at home. But yeah, same thing, like probably grew up being a little bit...
Partly because like you feel like you need to assimilate and you kind of feel embarrassed about it because you're not very similar to, you know, the white folks. And then later on down the track, you feel like you've lost that type of touch, like the heritage, and you kind of want to bring it back. And I tried to learn Chinese and I struggled. Like it was so bloody hard.
As an
like,
adult or
yeah, as an adult.
up?
Like I actually tried like last year. I said to myself, let's do it. So I got some lessons. I did a few lessons and then I just said, man, this is way too hard. I don't even know how I did it when I was a kid. So I just gave up. Yeah. Partly because I was running a business as well. Yeah.
Well, I feel weird asking this because like we went to high school together, but like what was high school like for you? You know, like if you sort of walk through, Sefton was a very Asian dominant school. You know, and obviously we know, like I'm sort of filling in these gaps for you on your behalf. Actually, it's like friends who are Asian as well, but
we were 90% Asian.
90% Asian,
90%
very dominant
Asians,
Asian school. So what was that like? You know, sort of growing up in Sefton.
Well, I've always loved school, but I think I'm quite adaptable. And so school was a really great... I had a conversation about high school with some friends the other day, and we were talking about our experiences in high school, and I always loved it. Like it was just such a safe environment. You feel obviously very comfortable, and not because everyone else was Asian as well, but because, you know, school environment is always very safe. You have a routine, you know exactly what you're doing. And I think I really just thrived in that environment. And I loved learning and I loved school. I loved playing sport. I know you mentioned that, you know, we played a lot of sport together. And so high school was great for me. Primary school was fantastic too. So I think I was really fortunate to have a very supportive, you know, safe environment throughout my schooling. But not that it changed. I think university was really when I had left my comfort zone. Because there weren't 90% Asians around.
Only 85% now.
No, well, I went to Macquarie University, and all my friends went to like UTS or other unis, and I was the only one from my group or my friends that had gone to Macquarie. So then I really had to, you know, make new friends, meet new people. A lot of kids I met were from different parts of Sydney as well, and that was really the first time I realised, you know, the difference between our upbringing and our communities, and how not just, well, I guess you would say disadvantaged, considering that we came from a lower socioeconomic community, but really just the lack of opportunities that I had compared to my friends that I had met in university. I grew up in different parts of Sydney, and that's when I really noticed the stark difference in our childhood and our upbringing and the opportunities that we were afforded.
Can you tell us about any of these specific stories that you might have?
I think just in terms of schools, for example, like we used to sit and sweat out in demountables, and you know that was normal for us at school. And then there was just no, you know, other extracurricular activities. There'd be like, unless you're a really high achieving student, there'd be like some scholarship or whatever it is to engage. But we mainly did like local sports, whereas like friends I met would go on excursions overseas, and they participate in just other things that I would have never thought of or had the opportunity to do. So it's just a contrast.
I have a good example where, you know, when I was in high school and primary school, like I played basketball during like, you know, recess, lunch and in mornings, but I didn't even know that there was basketball outside of school. Like until after high school, I realized, wow, you can actually do stuff like after school, like, and you can actually go to an event or you can have a competition and teams. I actually didn't even know about it at all.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was so weird. And then after that, I've been playing basketball. I've been part of a basketball team since like high
You're
school.
making up for all the high school.
Yeah.
Literally. I've been playing basketball for like my whole life now after high school. So it's ridiculous. And then I kind of blame my parents.
Yeah, I think that's just not knowing local sports club. But we definitely didn't have like a swimming pool at our school or,
that's
you know,
right.
those facilities that other schools do.
Yeah, I remember talking to a friend who he went to King's School, which is not far up the road from our studio here in Oatlands, and he literally said, I was like, what did you do for sport? And like I told him, I was like, I'd play, you know, like touch footy and stuff like that. And he'd be like, I did equestrian.
Oh my
And I was
God.
like, wow, okay. I was like, that's a chasm, like in terms of like how big of a difference in terms of what they did from sports, where you like played polo, things like that. But yeah, it's just like you only see that, I feel like the first forays like in uni, when you get people from different walks of life and you're sort of studying the same thing. Speaking of uni, did you always want to do law?
No, I think like I wanted to be a police woman at one point in time when I was growing up, physio. So I had, you know, different interests. But I think I saw law and university as an opportunity to expand my knowledge. And I saw law as something that, you know, encroaches on every industry and all aspects of life. So it was good to have a good understanding of the law. So that's really why I chose it. I always knew I wanted to do something else, like not just a one degree. So I did do a combined degree of commerce and law, but I don't think I really ever had an intention of becoming a lawyer. That wasn't ever a dream. It was just, what can I study that's going to you know, give me a lot of different opportunities and expand my mind and knowledge.
And has that changed for you? Like, do you now want to be a lawyer more, or has that, you know?
Well, I like what I like most about the law and studying the law is that it is really, well, we call it, you know, the justice system, but it's just a legal system. But I think knowledge of the law really makes a difference between people's lives and being able to understand the systems that are in place to navigate and ensure that, you know, the most vulnerable people in our communities can get the help and understand their rights. And I see that, you know, for a lot of minority communities, marginalised communities. So when I started where I work now in the community legal sector, it was because I was really interested in this role where I was coordinating a migrant employment legal service, because so many migrants and temporary visa holders who come to this country don't get any information about what their rights are and are highly exploited. And not just migrants and temporary visa holders, young people, people from cold backgrounds, because they don't understand the law. And it's a difficult system to navigate. So for me, it was really about how do I break down those barriers? How do I make the law more accessible so that there's greater equality within our societies, that people are able to have an even, you know, footing in work in particular? And so that's probably one of the reasons why I then decided to pursue law as a career.
I find that very similar to me as well, because like I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I just chose an accounting because my parents told me to do. And then when I did it, I hated it. And then over time, I realized I can really help people with this. Like, you know, I can really help businesses. And I feel, exactly the same as you. And then now I just love it so much. And I can see that this is like my passion and my, you know, my calling. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
I got a question around, you know, because you've always done a lot of community work. I mean, even during, I remember high school, but even like certainly a university and thereafter, like Y-Collab was like obviously a big thing. There was something that you mentioned which was sort of around, like you were talking about the mentality gap between the previous generation and say our current generation as well. Can you talk a little bit about what that's about, and like what's your experience with that?
So I think like the generational gap is something that's like across the board with different generations, with, you know, changing society, advancement technology. It's just different values and views that each generation may hold as a collective. But I think my personal experience, you know, as a second gen migrant, the child of refugees, compared to, you know, the first gen, our parents' generation. Like when they came to Australia, it was really about how do I build a life for my family, right? And how do I ensure that, you know, my kids are in school and they become successful and we have a roof over our heads and enough food on the table, and that we didn't stand out too much because this is not our home country, right? We left our country, we come to Australia, the lucky country, so that we could rebuild our lives and ensure that, you know, our kids don't have to face the same hardships that we did. And so I think that's a very common sentiment amongst the first generations, where they just put their head down, work really hard, and obviously coming to Australia at that point in time, you know, for most people or families from Indochina and that community after, you know, the 70s or mid-70s, which is off the back of, you know, abolishment of White Australia policy, you know, multiculturalism finally being a thing, but, you know, off the back of that, facing a lot of racism, a lot of discrimination. And to be frank, I don't think that it's gone away. I just think that, you know, we've done a better job of being more subtle with our racism, but I think racism, discrimination and microaggressions still largely exist. But I think our generation as a second gen, you know, we grew up in Australia in a Western culture, and whilst our parents probably tried really hard to still instill those values that they hold dear in us, I think, you know, the Western culture is much more influential because we grew up in the education system here and the society here. So I think it can be very conflicting, and probably was very conflicting for a lot of people, and that's why we were ashamed, you know, to speak our own language. We wanted to be more white and blend in a bit more. But I think we were also taught to stand up for what we believe in and speak out, whereas our parents really didn't do that and put their head down. So I think that generationally and why we're seeing greater representation is because we're owning our spaces, and we're, you know, no longer just accepting being pushed to the side and being, you know, treated like second-class citizens. And I think the second generation is really owning that now, and, you know, we're seeing that with, I think your as Level Asian podcast was about like building our own house. So if people aren't going to make space for us in the house and we're sitting outside looking in, then we'll just build our own bloody house.
Exactly. Yeah. And like we've heard the term like third culture, which is essentially what we are. Like we sit in between sort of the Eastern and Western, and we're like this weird in between, right? Did you ever feel like you had those sort of identity issues in that sense? You're like, I didn't quite feel Aussie, but I didn't quite feel Asian or Vietnamese in your case. Did you ever have to tackle that sort of identity when you were growing up?
Yeah, I think when you're growing up with like two opposing cultures and values, you're always going to have that conflict, especially when you're young and you can't navigate it, and there wasn't as much support because you don't see or hear like amazing podcasts like this where there is strong representation and a reflection on who you are. So I think every young person who grows up in that scenario is always going to have to overcome that identity crisis, I guess. But I think that we've also come to a point, because I feel like even if we're second generation born and raised here, because of, you know, our parents' story and journey to Australia, and, you know, in our lifetime there was still very overt racism as well, and there still is. But I think that it's, but what we talked about earlier about that shame of our culture and our identity, I think that's really changing, and I've only, I think, realised that more so in my adult life, and I hope that the next generation and younger people can feel really proud of their dual identity. But like I think that we have the best of both worlds, like our third culture, but it is so enriching and we bring so much to the table. And I think it's amazing that we have obviously, you know, understand Western culture and values here, but also have, you know, the heritage and culture of our parents in our home country. And I think the problem isn't necessarily with us. I think it's, you know, Australia for so long has treated newly arrived migrants and people that come to Australia as, you know, and I don't know, I always feel, and I see this very clear in the first gen, is that even to this day, it seems like they don't feel like we are true Australians. Like Australia is, this notion of Australians is like more still a white Australian.
You're right.
And I think that we need to own that space. And I think being Asian Australian, you know, is our superpower. And I say that all the time now because I think it's so true, because we're like your podcast Level Asian, right? Like we're leveling up as Asians. You know, it's a powerful thing to be and to have that heritage and identify as an Australian. And even for myself growing up, you know, I was like, am I a true Australian? I'm not white. You know, I look different to what a quintessential Australian is supposed to be. And I think that notion of who an Australian is really changing, because young people are, you know, taking ownership of our identity, and I think that that's really shifted from the previous generation who felt like they were still guests in this country. But I think our generation and subsequent generations are saying, no, we're Australian too, and this is our home too, and our identity and our heritage only enriches this country and our communities.
Do you kind of see a huge shift coming from the younger generations as well? Because like now we're in this time period where we're kind of embracing everything. But with the younger kids, do you think that they're going to step up into bigger roles because they can have this representation while they're growing up?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And you can see, like, I think a prime example of that is, you know, the plight of our First Nations community. And you see now in terms of, you know, the younger generation taking ownership, even though it's been like 200 years since colonisation, and all the things that, you know, our First Nations people had gone through, where now it's like we're even changing the narrative around Australia Day. And, you know, that hadn't happened in the last couple of generations. It's happening now because I think young people are more civically engaged and they see it as their future that's at stake. And you see that with, you know, the climate action movement as well, where young kids are striking for climate action. Like we never did anything like that growing up. And I think it's a great thing that they are politically engaged and they are keeping our leaders accountable, because we know that if we keep doing things the same way and we don't challenge the status quo, then nothing's going to change. And I really have a problem with, you know, that thinking of this is the way it's always been done. So, you know, this is the way it's going to continue to be. And, you know, if we don't challenge that and we accept that, then our future is at stake. And I think the young generation is like sees that and are taking that into their own hands.
Yeah, 100%.
I was going to ask also, at what stage, because everyone like looks at like Thule and they're like Thule, the whole, you know, Labor thing with the whole parachuting situation. But when did you actually get into politics?
When did I actually get into politics? Well, I joined the Labor Party when I was in uni.
Okay.
So I didn't really grow up in like a political household or anything like that. We never spoke about politics at the table. But I think just, you know, my interests and the work that I did within the community, it was really just like a series of events that sort of led me there. I think the biggest catalyst really for it was when I worked in an electorate office. So I worked for a local MP, and that's when I had, you know, my real taste of politics and how, or what the difference that politics can make into people's lives. And I think a lot of that is because, you know, we are quite comfortable here and living in a democracy like Australia where we have the benefit of healthcare, and you know, superannuation, and there's a safety net to protect people. I think that because life is so comfortable, most people maybe disengage from politics a little bit because they get on with their daily lives and they, you know, worried about their family unit and their community. But I think that all the work that I did within the community, and most telling is my community organising work, where we would spend a lot of time, you know, community organising was all about building people power for the common good around issues that are important to our community. And we spent so much time, you know, trying to contact MPs to get them to listen to community and what communities want. So that was really frustrating, where we couldn't even get a meeting with a lot of MPs who didn't want to listen. So, you know, I saw the importance of decision making and how the decisions that our elected representatives make a difference in our life and affect our life. And then also to my experience working in the political office and, you know, knowing the local member being supported and mentored by him as well. And I always say, without the sponsorship of Chris Hayes, like if it wasn't for an older white man supporting me, I would not have had the opportunity to even put my hand up and run for a federal seat in Parliament.
Well, I'd really like to know, like, because you've been in the political space and like you said, you've represented marginalised communities, but also stepping up was, you give credit to a white man. What has your experience been like being a young Asian female in Australia's political field?
I think it can be very intimidating, because I think the view is that, politics is for this elitist class of people, and there's no space for others, and particularly those from marginalised communities. So I think it was difficult, but I wasn't alone. So there is within Labor a diversity group, and the people that I've worked with and met within that group has been really, and this is across factions too, just really supportive. We have a really clear common goal of what we want to be able to achieve, which is greater diversity within the ranks within the party. But I would say that when I talk to my friends or to people that aren't necessarily interested in politics, like they get completely turned off by it. And like I don't necessarily talk a lot about it to my friends, but I think it's important to, because as I said, politics and our politicians make decisions that impact our daily lives. And so we need to be aware, we need to be politically engaged. But unfortunately, a lot of people weren't. But from my experience and what had happened in Fowler, and even putting my hand up, so many people had reached out to me, and like seeing the outcome too from the federal election, people can see the power of their vote, and people can see for the first time that, their vote always had mattered, but that their voices are important. And I think sometimes because of people's view of politics, it means that politicians, I think politics is all about listening to your community and then representing the collective views of your community in Parliament. But it's strange because in Southwest Sydney, I don't know how much you guys know about Southwest Sydney, but it is somewhat a Labor heartland, or was a Labor heartland. And so people are always just, it's always going to be the same people and the same party voted in. But clearly the results and the outcomes show that the people had spoken out about it, and, have sent a really clear message that you can't take us for granted. We're not just going to, we're not idiots and just vote the same way. And no matter who you put up, we're going to vote for you. Like that doesn't work anymore. And I think people are really taking ownership of their vote and understanding now, what they're actually voting for, as opposed to always just voting for one party because that's how their parents did it, or that's their understanding of what that party stands for.
That really resonates with me, because I would say that when I was 18 all the way to about probably 2 years ago, so even 28, just don't know what I'm voting and play around with the whole election.
Donkey vote, right?
Yeah, donkey vote straight away. Yeah. I didn't get it. I just didn't understand
Shame
it. And I'll be honest, the reason being is because I just didn't think it would matter anyway. Yeah, they really wouldn't have. I didn't really want to stress about politics, because I just felt like it was just, to me, having to make a decision on politics, it just felt like it would just stress me out more. So, and I was so focused on like looking after my family and just caring about family, I just really didn't want to think about all the outsides, because it just wouldn't have made a change. But hearing this and seeing what's happening right now, I actually consider it a lot more, which is great. But yeah, man, back then I just didn't really think about it at all.
I personally probably wasn't interested in politics up until probably just before COVID. And the only reason for that was COVID was a big one. The amount of Asian hate and the racism. I think I remember, I don't know if you remember too, it was like there was these 2 Asian girls in Marrickville who got spat on.
Yeah.
And I was like, fuck, I was actually really angry when I saw it. It was the first time I had because usually I see this sort of stuff and I'm like, it happens. But that was the first time I saw it, and I was just like, that was completely unwarranted. And then obviously there was a whole subsequent series of different sort of racial hate crime as well. And even just if we talk about bushfires, some of the floods and natural disasters and stuff like that, and just sort of seeing the lack of, I guess, responsibility or trying to do something about it, I think really pissed me off. I think that was the main thing. And this was literally at a time when I was actually traveling, overseas for a year. So I was actually witnessing this actually outside of the country. that was when I really started to get into understanding like what the hell was going on, because prior to that, you think about, previous prime minister, or, there's a lot of just like changing prime ministers prior to that. It was probably happened like 3 or 4 times. And so it was only until like this upcoming election where I was just like, I actually have to, actually put a concerted effort into choosing my vote and feeling like I'm actually contributing to what it is that I want. Because I was the same as Davey. I was like, just vote whatever, and it's always the results always seem to be the same.
Yeah, and the great thing about this is that we're starting to see like representation of Asians, and it just makes me feel really proud, like seeing that, like seeing people in Hollywood, seeing politics, seeing more businesses out there, and creatives. It's just amazing, man. So it's good. Props to you. Without you guys, I wouldn't have changed my mind at all. So.
Well, I probably think about. I feel like like your situation too with what happened was a big catalyst for this. I don't know if you felt that way. Did you? Like, I mean, you probably wouldn't think that way because us as, Asians in general, we sort of try to be pretty humbling about it. But like, I sort of think about that and I'm like, where it started outside of like, I feel like there was all this tension built up during COVID and all these things happening. But then it was like the whole, you running for politics, and then that set a whole cascade of the mainstream media put a bigger microscope on it. So when it happened, you must have like had, your phone must have been buzzing and it must have like ringing. You had got obviously a lot of attention for it. Like, what was that like around that time?
Yeah, that was a couple of months ago now. I think back in August. And I think it was really, I was really thrusted into the limelight when it was announced that
You didn't call your PR person?
Christina Keneally was going to be parachuted in. That's when it all really started, the media storm. No, I didn't. It was funny because I had all these journalists contact me and reporters, and I was like, yeah, okay, I'll do an interview. And they're like, one of them asked me, okay, so who's your PR guy? And I'm like, I don't have a PR guy.
Wait. Let me call him for you.
I'm fielding all of this on my own. I actually had some friends, I was like, you got to help me with responding to people. So then they would log onto their Facebook and like send responses and stuff like that. But yeah, I was navigating all of it on my own. And, it came as such a shock to me because I didn't know about it until it came out in the media.
Oh, so you didn't know at all?
No, I didn't know.
So you blindsided?
Yeah.
Wow.
And I mean, like, I had only, to be very clear, had put my hand up for pre-selection for the Labor Party. So it's still an internal process for one party, and I had expected that there's going to be competition. It's obviously very competitive, and for a safe, a seemingly safe Labor seat, a lot of people would, go after it. So I expected a competitive process. I just didn't expect the party or head office to make the decision to just parachute someone in. I think if it was more competitive, then that would have given me an opportunity to really prove myself, to talk about what I stand for and what I intended to do and contribute as a candidate. But I didn't even have that opportunity. And I think the reason why my experience had resonated with so many people and got so much attention, the first thing is because it was then Senator Christina Keneally, who was a very high-profile politician. She was a deputy in the Senate as well, and everyone knew her as the former premier. She had come out, to the southwest when she was premier. And then the second thing too, I think that my experience just really resonated with a lot of people because a lot of people are like, another, minority being sidelined, by a privileged white person, really. And so I think that really angered a lot of people. But the media attention was overwhelming. I really didn't have time to react or to reflect on what was going on. It was just go, go, go for a period of time. And after that, I had a lot of people, particularly within the party, say, I can't believe you did that. Can't believe you spoke out about the party. And I'm like, what do you mean? They asked me questions and I, answered them with my truth. And apparently I didn't even realize how frowned upon that would have been because other people in my situation would have just stayed quiet, not commented and then just like go away quietly. and like, you know, let the decision come to fruition without, you know, speaking out about it. But I did, and that was highly frowned upon in the party. But I just, you know, I don't regret it. And I think it was really important for me to speak up about it because I thought it was, you know, not the right decision. And I think that it was really, you know, a lot of people within the community just felt really insulted by the decision to have someone with little to no connection to the local area parachuted in and represent them. And, you know, I don't need to go on about it, but the results speak for itself, and the community, you know, resoundingly responded to that.
Yeah. Look, I've always said this. I'd never want to be a politician because I feel like it's like,
For now.
maybe later on.
You never know, right?
But I used to, like 5 years ago, like I would never want to be a politician because I feel like you need to fix in and you need to watch exactly every single word you have to say. I talk a lot and I may sound like I'm very confident, but I'm very self-conscious. So some things that I might even say on this podcast, I'll think about it for weeks. It's weird. So how do you get over that? Like I feel like as a politician or, you know, in politics, like, you know, whatever you said on PR or on the news.
It gets what's the word?
Gets
like
obscured.
Yeah, you get put under the microscope, right? You get misquoted, and there's a whole bunch of things that are misconstrued. Like,
how do you go with that?
For sure. I mean, it's public life. You know, you're committing yourself to a very public life, to be scrutinized, to be kept accountable and held accountable. I think with this, that's part of the responsibility. And so you know, everyone's human. You're going to make mistakes. You don't want to dwell on it for weeks after, but you want to learn, right? And you want to be able to continually grow and improve and be a better person and be, as a politician, a better representative. And I think that means, you know, actually listening. I think, you know, the politics, as I had mentioned, and sometimes we see our politicians, and I think that a lot of people, there's a growing distrust of politicians. And you think, you know, they just got to say whatever to whoever, and they don't actually care about community. I really care about my community. I care about, you know, making a difference in the community. So I think that's what drives me. And then everything else, like, for sure I'm going to make mistakes. For sure I'm going to say really stupid things that I'm going to regret. But then it's, you know, on YouTube or the media or whatever. But you just have to overcome that.
Has there been any? Like, can you give us some examples?
Oh, for sure. Like, no one likes hearing the sound of their own voice, right? And so when I try not to, like, my family would turn on the drum or something, like, oh, look, you know, my nephews would be like, oh, my auntie's on TV. And I'm like, I can't watch it. I have to leave the room. I've like said things that were silly, or, you know, I could have rephrased it. But really, I think it just takes practice as well. And I've had a lot of practice in the last couple of months, which has been great. And it's just been such a huge learning curve. So even though, you know, the outcome isn't ideal for me personally, and as you had mentioned, Ken, I think it's just sparked a national conversation about how important diversity and representation is, particularly in politics, but across the board. And if, you know, my experience somehow had contributed to that and made an impact, then I'm super proud of that.
Yeah, and I'm like really conscious not to like make it out like you're some martyr. You're like, oh, I've like sacrificed myself. You know, like it's not that, because like you are still with Labor right now and you're still in politics, which I didn't know until we started this conversation, right?
Oh, you thought I like...
Yeah, I was like, oh, you're
I'm
like,
doing the dabbing.
Anyway. But like, what's, obviously because you're staying in it, what's the goal for you, you know, in the next few years? Are you going to try and run again? What's the plan?
Yeah, well, a lot of people are like, why don't you run as an independent? A lot of people are angry at me now. They're like, you didn't stand up for us. You didn't run as an independent. Really angry?
Like actually angry?
Yeah, they are.
Oh, man.
Well, so you're always going to get that, right? You can't please everybody, and you can't, like, not everyone's going to like you. So that's probably something
I can't do
with you out for years.
And that's just life, right? You can't have everyone like you and love you. But I consciously chose not to run as an independent, and also to stay in the party, because I still believe in the values of the Labor Party. I still believe that, you know, a Labor government is going to be able to deliver the best results for our country as a whole. And, you know, I'm so optimistic about the future, even hearing now Prime Minister Albanese's speech when he won, and also, you know, the first move he did in terms of putting the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags behind him. And then one of the first things he said was also his commitment, or the party's commitment, to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. All those things are very exciting to me because it gives me a lot of hope for the future, and also to just taking action on climate, just things that people in the community and Australians have been saying that this is what we want for so long, but we just weren't listened to. So I'm very excited about the future, but I think for me, the reason why I had stayed in Labor, because as I said, Labor values are still very fundamental to me, but I also think that, you know, change takes organising, it takes mobilising and building people power, not only, you know, from the outside, but from within institutions as well. And I think, like, you know, a lot of our systems and our structures are inherent or are still embedded in inequality, racial inequality, gender inequality. And I think to break that down, it takes action from both outside and from within. And that's what I'm committed to working on. So for me, in the immediate term, local organising is what I'm actively doing at the moment, working with the diversity group within the party that I mentioned as well, to ensure that we do have greater representation in our candidates. And we're also ensuring that you know, politics and party politics is more accessible, because, you know, we grew up in communities and families where it just seems so unattainable. We didn't have the networks, we didn't have the knowledge about it. And so being able to create those opportunities for others who may be interested in joining the party or in politics to be able to learn from the inside, I think is really important. And that's what I'm committed to at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, I think about even like decisions made by MPs, even local councillors and stuff like that, more often than not, probably was, you know, Caucasian, you know, male or female. And I remember thinking, even this was like 5 or 10 years back, it was like, how is it that you can make a decision for marginalised communities if you don't even know what we go through, right? Like, and then you sometimes talk about that as well. So, like, what's your thoughts on that? Because it's like, do we have to have someone in, you know, Parliament or politics or in council, wherever it is, who look like us, who come from us, to be able to make that decision? Or can people who, like Chris Hayes, who, you know, is white, you know, older, from a different sort of upbringing, be able to still make those decisions as well?
Yeah, well, you can't be, you know, everything to everyone. So, you know, if I was a member of Parliament, I'm Vietnamese Australian, doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, I'll only champion issues that are important to Vietnamese Australians. So I think you can obviously represent all. I think it depends on the person that you are and what you're there to actually achieve. And I know I go back to always saying that it's about actually listening to the voices of your community and representing their collective views. But obviously, I think in terms of, and why representation is so important, it's because we have different lived experiences. We have different you know, talents that we bring to the table. And so when you have people with diverse lived experiences that, you know, make decisions for a collective, then you're going to have that level of understanding and that empathy with certain communities to be able to better represent them. So I think there's definitely value in having, and then that's why I've been, you know, and I think we're seeing that it is important now, but why I've been championing diversity and representation, not only within parliaments, but I think across, you know, any leadership position, how important it is. And we see that in corporate, in the corporate world as well. Like when you have, and it can't just be tokenistic, like, oh, we've got this one person. I was watching a 7:30 report yesterday and then reading the response. So it was about racism and discrimination within a government department. And then the response from the government department was, oh, you know, our executive, our CEO was a person of colour. And
just to validate it, right?
Yeah, right. And then I just think that, you know, like that's a terrible lie. Like, just to say we're not racist because, you know, one of our executives is a person of colour. So how can we be racist? Like that's it's a terrible tokenistic trope that like we can see beyond that. So I think having a seat at the table is one thing and representation is one thing, but it's so much more important to consider, you know, what is that person actually bringing to the table, not just sitting at the table. And I think for so long, because, you know, we've been knocking on the doors of someone else's house, or, you know, a house that we don't necessarily belong to, we just want to get in. But I think we've hit a critical mass where we can, you know, build our own house or build enough power to knock that house down and build a big mansion collectively together, which is, you know, an ideal world, but we have a lot of issues, as community, as a nation, to overcome before we get to that point. But I think, with the new government and, the changes I can already see within the government, but within our society, with greater representation across the board. I'm really excited as to what's going to come in the future.
Yeah. You speak a lot about diversity and representing certain communities as well, especially disadvantaged communities. I know you said, like, for example, you going to university and you've seen how other people can be more advantaged. But because you're helping so many other communities, was there a pivotal time that you realized, hey, I need to make a change. I can stand up for other people and have a voice?
I think it was largely based on my own experience growing up, and then obviously seeing the dichotomy of, the different life that people lead depending on their postcode, really, and where you grow up, and the community that you're raised in could really, define your life. And I think that it's really important that we break through those barriers, because as a relatively young woman of colour, I have overcome certain barriers, but I know that we face a lot of barriers and more challenges than others do, purely because of who we are and our identity. And I think that, as a collective, we need to be conscious of that and to be able to break down those barriers and make it easier for others too. So I don't think it was, a light bulb moment where I'm like, I'm going to do this. I think it was just through my experience, through connecting with others, through the work that I do in the community. I just see it like wherever I can contribute and provide that opportunity for others, then I would. And, we talk about, building a house. I think the problem, and not the problem, but I see a lot of, what we call trailblazers who have, done something that others like them have never done before, and then get there into that position, really just like slam the door shut behind them, because they're like, I jumped through all these hoops and I had to go through so much, and so everyone else has to too. And we hear a lot of these stories about women who do that, like women in exec positions who are like, I had to go through so much, so you shouldn't have. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Why should you have it easy when I had to endure so much? But I don't see it as that. I don't think like that at all. I think that you have a responsibility, particularly as a trailblazer who's led the way, to make sure that you pave the way for others. So, I always say that, don't slam the door behind you, just knock the bloody house down and then let everyone who, wants an opportunity, who wants to learn from you. Because if you're a trailblazer, clearly you're inspiring, people go look up to you. And I think that then comes with a sense of, or some responsibility for you to ensure that others are also afforded the opportunities that they may not have, purely because of who they are, and their identity, or where they grew up and live.
I'm actually curious, how do you actually get into politics? So like, if I was like, a young guy coming out of uni, how do you actually get into politics? Do you have to get the experience? Because I spoke to a few clients, and they are in politics, and they mentioned to me they had to work under someone for a little while first. And then, after working from someone, they had to get this like sponsorship or some sort of like, connections. Is that how it works?
I mean, I don't think there's a clear like path or progression to enter into politics. I think people have different ways in which they can enter politics, but I would say that it's not easy, and that oftentimes, like, because I had worked for a politician in an electorate office, so oftentimes people do work for a politician and maybe enter into politics themselves as an elected rep, but I think a lot of people join from like young Labour or young Liberal within a university. So like there's a strong presence of like the party at uni. So that's sometimes how people join, or through family, or through someone they know. And it's often through someone they know. Some sort of connection. Not really. Yeah? So that's the usual. Yeah. I think maybe parties don't do a very good job at being more accessible and open. And I can see, like, I'm involved in the branch in Cabramatta. That's my local branch for the Labor Party. And as I mentioned, like, I am very committed to organising locally, making sure that, young people who are politically engaged are thinking about joining a party, actually know what Labor stands for, make a conscious decision and, see all the major parties and, decide for them, like, who is most aligned to their own values, and then to join that way and get involved locally. I think we always hear this, that politics, all politics is local. I really believe that. So getting involved locally is always the first step. But it's not easy.
Yeah.
And unless I had joined because I had a friend that was already in the Labor Party, and that's the common method. But I think that if you are civically engaged, you think that, and obviously, we hear often now they say, change the country. To change the country, you've got to change the government. And so, getting involved in party politics is one way in which you can start that journey. But I would say too, like, when people want to get involved in politics, they want to be a politician. I think I have an issue with people who are like, this is what I want to do. I want to be a career politician. So everything I do, it's, to ensure that I get there. But I think it's so much more important when you have diverse experience, when you do other things in life, work in the community, and then enter into politics with that experience behind you, because that's when you're going to be able to make the best decisions for the community, right? Yes. Because you understand what they're going through and the experiences and issues of your local community to be able to better represent them.
Yeah, but I'm also curious then, like, if you, enroll or you fill out a form or whatever it is, like, do they vote? How does that part work then? Like,
fill out a form to join a party? Yeah, well, and that's another thing too. So the usual process for pre-selection, for example, is what they call a rank and file vote, member vote. So that means local members of the party get to choose who the candidates are going to be. So that's another reason to potentially join a party that, your values are aligned to, and you think stands for what you stand for.
Yeah, so you kind of have the experience and backing and kind of network it before you join, because there's no point joining if you don't know what you're doing or you don't know anyone.
But then join to learn, and then join to build those networks. Yeah, if you're interested in party politics.
Yeah, the only reason why I ask is because I'm sure people out there will want to know. Yeah, I've always thought about it, and again, I was always.
You want to join the Labor Party?
No, I've always said what about how do you actually become a politician? Yeah. Because there's no clear-cut way. It's like you don't learn it in university, you don't learn it in school at all.
No, there's no degree in there's a degree in political science and politics, but there's no degree that makes you qualified to be a politician. Like that, right? You know what? The qualification is real life experience, right? And what you've done to contribute. I think a lot of people, and we see, and this is why maybe people are turned off, because you see a certain type of people who go into politics because you're a politician, you get to be a leader and stand up and speak on behalf of others. But I think I always go back to, it's about representing community voices.
But also I think
anyone
about,
can do it.
I've spoken to a few people, and very respected people, either in the community as business owners or whoever, and the common answer I've seen is always like, nah, wouldn't go into politics. You know what I mean? Like, it's like some people see politics as like the pinnacle. This is what they want to strive for. But then on the flip side, I also see people who go, I don't see the benefit of going into politics. So I think what you're trying to say, or at least how I'm interpreting it, is that you probably have accumulated a lot of experiences through what you would normally say do, whether it's in business or community or life. And then through that probably shapes your views on things. And then when you decide that you want to have an impact, you go into politics. Because I sort of think about some of no names come to mind at the moment, but certainly I think of like, there are people who are, I think like surgeons or, like in the medical practice, or business owners who then eventually move into politics, because then it's not even about, it's not about the money, that's for sure. Like, it's actually about like, how do you actually help to improve, the community and that sort of stuff. Is that what you're...
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You probably make more money as a business owner than a politician. But I view it as, a community service. You're there to serve the people. And I think maybe the misunderstanding is, politics is... maybe it's not a misunderstanding, but politics can be seen as, a very dirty game. And because there are only very few positions that, some people have to do whatever it takes to become a politician. So it can be very off-putting. And also too, you're highly scrutinized, right? It's public life that you're living. And you have to be held accountable. So anything you say and do, people are going to, pick at it. And so that may turn a lot of people off too. But I definitely see it as, you know, a service to the community. And I think like that's the only way you should really be viewing politics. But what I've experienced in the past is that a lot of people don't necessarily see it that way, and they like politicians serve us as community. But a lot of times, you know, communities see it as the other way around. So they put politicians on this like pedestal and they're almost treated as rock stars. But I don't think that should be the case, and we need to keep them accountable. We need to, you know, hold them to what they say that they will do, and it shouldn't just be like, we shouldn't just judge them on how eloquently or articulate they are. It's about, you know, their actions and the decisions they make for our lives. And I don't know, we tend to forget that sometimes, but it's really important and just fundamental to what politics and representation and elected representation is all about in democracy like ours.
Yeah. I've got a younger sister, and her and her friends are very, very in the political space, and they go to protests, and like, she's finishing high school soon. But even when, I think I told you how Albanese was visiting Eastwood, she went with all of her friends, she got a selfie with him, got photos with him, everything. I don't think she wants to go into the political space, but for young women or younger generations out there who are looking to be able to pave a way to create a voice and creative space for themselves, or even go into politics, do you have any words of advice for them?
I love that to hear that your sister's so civically and politically engaged. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good start. Like, don't be afraid of politicians. Like, they're there. And when I worked in the electorate office, like, only a very small percentage of the community actually come knocking on the door, asking for things, telling the, their elected representative the issues that they're facing in their day-to-day lives and what changes they want to see to help the community. We shouldn't be afraid to reach out to our local MP, write to them, try to get a meeting with them, even like informing them about what the great work that you're doing here with Social Wave, with your business, or with the podcast as well. I think they take to Parliament, what they hear on the ground. And so we need to do our duty to make sure that they listen and they hear us out about the things that are important to, your sister as a young person who's going to be finishing school. So I think a lot of times people, like we said, put politicians on a pedestal, feel like, we can't engage with them because they're a politician, but really they're there to serve. So reach out to them, get active politically in parties as well, whether or not it's the Labor Party, which of course, I would spruik, but if they're more aligned to the Liberals or Greens or any other party, that's their fundamental right in this country to get politically engaged, because at the end of the day, everyone's going to vote, and don't do a donkey vote because you're wasting your vote and your vote matters. But it's really important. And unfortunately too, we still see, I think even in the most recent elections in Southwest Sydney, and it's always been a really high in terms of, I can't remember the term, but votes that don't count. And it's always been over 10%, which is a huge part of the population that probably just don't want to get fined and say, I just have to go
tick
and
it
vote.
off the list, right?
Yeah, and tick it off the list. But, we are really lucky. A lot of countries don't get to vote and live in an authoritarian nation where they don't even have that opportunity. And we have a big say to change our government, because changing the government changes the country.
I do want to, I'm conscious of time, but as well, I do have one more question around people who go into particularly practicing law, and so deviating away from politics. Law is perceived, at least I feel like amongst Asians, as a very prestigious role. Particularly around seeing as how much bloody money you can make from law.
Not in the community
not
legal
in the community,
sector.
exactly. So this is where I'm getting at, which is when you decided to move into community law, was that the first foray that you got into law? Did you do corporate law? Did you do any other type of law leading into it?
Well, I started off with my legal training in the community legal sector. I worked at RACS, the Refugee Advice and Casework Service. So that was my first legal experience. And then at that time, there was a change in government, and they got a lot of funding to the sector. So the sector was quite heavily reliant on government funding, because we don't get paid by clients. So all the services are free in the community legal sector. And then after that, I had no choice but to leave. There was just no job opportunities for a new young lawyer. And then so I moved into corporate law, which I did for some time, and I had enjoyed, but I just knew it wasn't something that I wanted to do long term. And, you know, there was job security, and obviously you can live very comfortably on a salary in the corporate world. But as soon as I had an opportunity to leave, I did, because I just knew it wasn't for me long term. And I saw my senior managers, and they were wonderful. It was a great team, it was a great company, but it just wasn't something that aligned to me personally, that I would see myself in like 5-10 years there. I think I would have just been miserable. And I was doing a lot of different things in the community outside of work as well. And so that's when I had run in with the then local member, Chris Hayes, on so many different occasions, on all the different community activities and events that I ran. And then he sort of came to me one day, because I was working in immigration law. He's like, oh, you know, that's a federal issue. I get a lot of immigration inquiries to my office. Why don't you come work for me? And then that's sort of how I started working in the Electorate office for the local member, and getting, you know, some obviously real key experience in a political office. And then the last thing I did, so I didn't stay for too long. The last thing I did was manage the election campaign in the previous election in 2019. And then after that, I moved back to the community legal sector in the organisation that I'm working for now, and I've been there since then. And I love it. Like, there's definitely no job security. I'm not going to make $1 million, but it's something that I personally find very fulfilling. It's not for everybody, but yeah, I think it's definitely something that I wake up very excited to do every day.
Where does the passion for all this community work come from? Because most people are selfishly worrying about themselves in their very small circle, and you've always been someone who, particularly, you know, in my personal experience in our relationship, as someone who's very community driven. Did your parents have an impact on that? Is it just around your experiences? Like, I know you probably said it's not like that one moment or that one event, but how did you like it? Because it's one thing to do it extracurricularly, but then it's like to make a whole career out of it is a whole different thing. So where does it all sort of come from?
Well, I've never really been driven by money, and I live a very minimalistic lifestyle. So I feel very comfortable, like financially, with where I am. But I think it just came from a very young age. It was sort of drilled in me from my family, but also my community. So I grew up in a Buddhist community. So I'm Buddhist. My family's Buddhist, but I was very active and was part of a Buddhist youth organisation that I've pretty much grown up in. Now I'm a youth leader in the organisation. So every Sunday I actually teach Dharma classes, so Vietnamese Buddhist scripture classes, or Buddhist scripture classes in Vietnamese to young kids. And it's just a big part of who I am. But I think growing up as a Buddhist and heavily involved in the community really had just developed my very strong service disposition. And it was all about not what I can do for myself, but in everything that I do and say and think, it's how does that benefit everyone else. So I think that's just been drilled in me from a very young age.
Yeah, amazing. That's cool. Well, that's my last question.
I have one. Yeah. So curious about politics and the career, right? So you mentioned that you worked in like politics, and you actually worked for Chris Hayes, and you were in the election campaign, and you helped out with that. What's it like? What do you do on a daily basis? In
the electorate office?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I do a lot of different things. So there are constituent inquiries. So at a federal level, things like immigration, Medicare, Centrelink. So those federal issues are what people often come, to their local member to discuss and for assistance with. And because Chris was obviously a white man, and the community in Fowler, so that's suburbs like Cabramatta, Canley Vale, Bonnerick, very diverse. There's a high proportion of Asian Australians, particularly Vietnamese Australians as well. But it is very diverse. There's lots of different community groups and organisations there. So I did a lot of the liaising and working with those groups. We ran a lot of forums because a lot of the information doesn't necessarily trickle down or reach community because it's always, it's not in language or it's not communicated to them in a way that communities understand. So it's a lot about educating communities about policy, about federal issues as well, and also creating space for communities to voice, their concerns. In terms of the election, so I was actually the campaign manager. And to be honest, like the seat of Fowler, ever since its conception, has always been held by Labor. I think other candidates or parties don't even bother. Well, they do put up candidates, but like in my experience, some of them didn't even show up or campaign.
Wow.
So they're just there, they're
Really?
just on the ticket. Yeah, and I think it's because obviously, they just assume that Chris Hayes is, or the Labor member or candidate, is always going to win anyway. And I think that because of that, it actually disadvantages the community. I think when there's a competitive election or process, then I think it's the community benefits because they actually see candidates, parties, fighting for the community and showcasing, what it is that they're going to do to improve the community and represent the community. But that hadn't been the case. So I always joke about it, but it's sort of true. I could have done nothing and he would have still won because he was the incumbent member and also a very good local member as well. But when we saw, in the last election, and you never hear when it comes to election time, I don't know if you guys hear about, marginal seats and parties and kind of throwing money, like we promise you this and that, because they're trying to win that seat, right? Because it can go either way. But I think the disadvantage of a safe seat, I always say, is that, the incoming party or member, may not, or the party generally may not focus much on the seat at all. And then obviously, the other parties won't even put in any resources because what's the point? And so when, the result had occurred and we got the result we did, I think it was a huge win for the community because they were like seeing Fowler on the news during election time for the very first time, and then the leader of the party had come to the seat, and usually they do tours of marginal seats where they're trying to win votes, and they Albanese had then come to Fowler, and that never happens. And so people were like, wow, our community is on the map and they're talking about us on national news, and that's something that's a good thing for us because then there's attention on the community and there's attention on the issues that are important to the community. So I think overall it's a big community win, and that's a positive that had come out of it, is that no party can take a seat for granted and they can't just assume that it's a safe seat because clearly there's no such thing as a safe seat now.
It's so interesting because for us Asians, we're just like, yes, that's a good win for us Asians. But now I didn't even think about if it's 50-50 or very close, it actually means it's really good for the community because they're fighting for representing the community more and trying to find benefits that swing it to one party. I actually never even thought.
And I think
about that.
what it does is it stops complacency, not just with the MP, but also with the community as well, because the community just goes on autopilot and they're just like, things will just be the way that they always are, which is something that you said that you're not a fan of. But also imagine being like an MP who's been doing it for a long time. You're like, well, if no one pipes up and says anything or does anything about it, I can just get away with it. Not saying all MPs are like that, but certainly for the ones who might be thinking that, it's probably going to be an easier decision as opposed to, like you said, keeping them accountable as well. So I guess to wrap it up, if obviously you do community legal work, and then obviously there's your work in politics as well. So if either of our listeners want to connect with you, learn more about what you do, where's the best place for them to find you?
Yeah, or they can reach out.
To your PR team, by the way.
Yeah, my PR team. I would respond eventually. But if anyone's interested in politics, in joining any party or just learning more. I'm quite accessible. I think I'm across most social media platforms. I try to be. It's exhausting. I don't know how people do it without a PR team. But I mean, I eventually get through it all. So that's the best way. But really, I mean, if you are, contact your local MP, get involved in a party. You can Google it. There's like an application form online. And if you're in Southwest Sydney, reach out to me, because that's what I'm consciously doing and focusing on now, is how we mobilise and organise locally and getting people who are interested and want to join and want to make a difference to their local community through politics to join that way.
Yeah, amazing. Appreciate you coming on. We'll drop all the links in the show notes as well for everyone to get in touch. But it's really good to see you. I feel like it's been like way too long. So hopefully it doesn't have to be that long next time. But yeah, thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Level Asian.
That's it.
Thanks for listening to the Level Asian podcast. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a 5-star review if you enjoyed the episode. And why not share it with friends and family who might enjoy it too? Also, make sure you head over to levelasianpodcast.com to join our email list and to receive the latest updates and get notified when the next episode drops. If you know a great guest we should feature, email us at contact@levelasianpodcast.com or DM us on our socials in the show notes. Catch you on the next episode.